We've seen a lot in this book of Joshua about battling our way into the promised land for our church and for our lives in the same way that they battled their way into the promised land that God had for them. We've seen miracles. We've seen how the Jordan River stopped and piled up so that they could cross over on dry land. We've seen how they marched around Jericho and the walls came a-tumbling down without even so much as having to lift a sword. We've seen some pretty amazing things. And if you remember last week, we saw how Gideon came and said, look, I was promised this land over here. We've won the war. Now give me that land. Well, from the end of chapter 14 until chapter 22, pretty much what goes on in the book of Joshua is the dividing up of the property. Each group or tribe is given their own area to live. And if you remember, at the very beginning of Joshua, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half of the Manasseh tribe had made a deal with Moses to stay outside of the promised land on the east side of the Jordan River. The reason was that they were cattle ranchers. And the land on the east side of the Jordan River was very fertile grasslands. And they said, this is a great place for us to raise our cattle and our sheep and our goats and all the other animals that we raise. Can we just have this land? And Moses said, okay, that's fine, but the rest of the land is for all the rest of the folks. And you can have this land over here, but you have to promise to send your soldiers to go and fight with your brothers. And they agreed. And so when they went across the Jordan River, all of the soldiers from Reuben and Gad and Manasseh went with them. And so now the story takes place where the battle is all won and the land has all been divided up, and Joshua sends those 2.5 tribes back to the land that Moses promised them. And some very interesting things happen. And I think this might be an incredibly germane passage for our nation today. So let's look carefully at what happened in this passage and see how we might learn how to agree to disagree. First, I think it's important that we celebrate each other's accomplishments. And there's 3 things that Joshua did to celebrate the end of this war that they had been in for about 5 years, taking over the Holy Land. He does 3 very important things that I think it's important for us to follow. First, Joshua commended them. He said, you have carried out everything Moses, the servant of God, commanded you, and you have obediently done everything I've commanded you. I think it's important that as we celebrate the good things that have happened in our lives and in our church, that we hand out some attaboys. You know, it's real nice to get a paycheck, but sometimes it's even nicer to get an attaboy. Mark Twain said, I can go for almost an entire week on one good compliment. I don't know if you realize it, but on the way out, if you say something nice to the pastor, it does him a whole lot of good. I put a lot of work into these messages, and when folks say they appreciate it or they learn something, that makes me feel pretty dang good. It's important that we commend one another on the good things that we do. It's important that we celebrate these victories and these steps that we make in progress in our life, and it's important that we commend one another. Now, my wife and I never gave our boys allowance. They didn't need any money. They had everything they could ever want. In fact, if it wasn't for those dang Power Rangers, I'd have been driving a Porsche. Those toys were expensive. We thought it was better than paying them for their obligations around the house to commend them. We always told them what a great job they did when they completed their task. And I think that if you have kids, you know that the times you told them what a good job they did, boy, their chest just got all puffed up and they were so proud of themselves. In the same way, we need to commend one another when good things happen in our church. If you see someone helping out around here and they're doing something good, make sure you commend them. Give them an attaboy or an attagirl. I think it's important. Secondly, Joshua not only commends them, but he admonishes them. That's a good $2 theological word, admonish. Look what it says. He said to them, only this, be vigilant in keeping the commandment and the revelation that Moses, the servant of God, laid on you. Love God, your God, walk in all His ways, do what He's commanded, embrace Him, serve Him with everything you are and everything you have. It's not just good enough in celebrating our accomplishments to tell one another how wonderful we are. We have to remind ourselves that there is a purpose to what we're doing. We have to admonish one another and say, look, this is all wonderful that we've made this wonderful progress in the life of our church, but we got to remember what's important. It's wonderful when you make it to a promised land in your life, but don't forget about who got you there. You see, it's real easy to kind of be fat, dumb, and happy when everything's going good, and to forget about who got you there, to forget about how God helped you through the process. It's real easy when times are going good to go, oh, I don't want to go to church today. But we need to be admonished to remember that there's some things we have to remember. When we're celebrating good times, we need to commend one another. We need to admonish one another. And then finally, something I think that's missing in our society today. After this, Joshua blessed them. He blessed them. Then Joshua blessed them and sent them on their way, and they went home. About the only blessing we do today is when somebody sneezes. But it's important for us to understand that in Hebrew culture at this time, a blessing was something very important. They weren't handed out very often. And not just anybody could give a blessing. Only the commander of the army could give a blessing to his troops. Only the priest could give a blessing to his congregation. Only a father could give a blessing to his children. And when blessings were handed out, they were something special. We don't bless one another very often these days. We don't ask that God be with someone as they go, or God reward them for the good works that they do. When we get to the end of an accomplishment, whether it's in our life or in our church, we need to remember to commend one another. We need to remember to admonish one another because we can't forget what got us there. And finally, we can't forget to bless one another because that's so important. Well, the other thing we need to understand from this passage is that when we finally get to that promised land, it doesn't mean everything's going to be perfect. We need to understand that conflicts will arise. Just because everybody has their own place to live in this holy land doesn't mean that we're all just going to get along happy jack. Sometimes conflict's going to arise, and here's why. Because people will do their own thing. They arrived at Gileath on the Jordan, touching on the Canaanite land. There they built an altar on the banks of the Jordan, a huge altar. People are going to do things in church we don't like. Some are going to dress funny. Some are going to sing off key. Okay, a lot of them are going to sing off key. Some are going to want to sing some of them rock and roll songs in church. Some are going to get all dressed up and make us feel uncomfortable. People are going to do their own thing because we're different. And not only in our church are people going to do their own thing, but in our nation, people are going to do their own thing. And when people do their own thing in our church, it doesn't mean that they don't love God anymore. And when people do their own thing in our nation, doesn't mean they aren't proud to be an American anymore. It's just because people are going to do their own thing. The Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, they got across the river and they said, man, it's a long way to go to church. Let's not go all the way over to that Ark of the Covenant thing. Let's just build an altar right here. This is a nice place. You see, if you remember, the only place that they were supposed to worship God was in front of the Ark of the Covenant. That was that little box they carried around like in Indiana Jones. And inside that box were the 10 Commandments and some other important things for their faith. And God resided in and around and through that Ark of the Covenant. And that's the only place they were supposed to worship. Well, these idiots from Gad and Manasseh and Reuben, they decided to build their own altar. And everybody got upset because our nature is to overreact. Oh my gosh, you built an altar? What does it say they did? When the people of Israel heard this, the entire congregation mustered at Shiloh to go to war with them. These were the same folks that they had just spent 5 years fighting next to, patching up the wounds of one another, going into towns and making sure that all of this promised land was belonged to them, and one little altar gets built, and they're ready to go to war with one another. Boy, it sure is good we aren't anything like these folks. One little election, and we Americans are all ready to go to war with one another because our nature is to overreact. The pastor wears one set of clothing on one Sunday that happens to have a gator on it, and half of you are willing to go to war with the pastor. Now, stuff's going to happen because people will do their own thing. We need to make sure that we don't overreact. We have to learn how to live together in peace. And I think this Joshua passage does a fabulous job of outlining 3 steps that we can take to live at peace in our families, to live at peace in our church, and to live at peace in our nation and even our world. But we have to pay close attention to them. Now, I talked to her earlier, and she agreed to this, and I talked about it in the early service. But there is a member of our church who is my opposite on most things. Many of you know Alta Trufant. She and I don't agree on anything politically. We have a whole lot of differences theologically. We just don't agree. And yet, I do not have a better friend or a stronger supporter in this church. That's because we have sat down with our differences and we have worked through them, and we've followed Joshua's method. It would be very easy for her to just say, I hate that pastor guy. He doesn't agree with anything I say. I'm going to a different church. But that doesn't solve anything. There's a thing called family systems theory. I'm a certified teacher in family systems theory, and here's how it goes. Any group is like a family. There are authority figures, the mom and dad. There are regular folks, the kids. And then there's the identified patient, that one rotten kid who always messes things up. And churches are just like that. We have authority figures, we have regular folks, and we have one rotten kid who always messes things up. And the interesting thing is, if the one rotten kid leaves, somebody else replaces them. We are a lot like a family, and if we're to get along as a church and as a nation, there's 3 very important things from this Joshua passage that we have to do. First, we have to make sure that we understand motives. We need to make sure that we understand the motives of the people that we disagree with. Look at what it says. Rebelling against or turning our backs on God was the last thing on our minds now. The Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, they weren't trying to rebel against God. They wanted to worship God in their own way, in their own land. Sure, they were a little lazy, didn't want to go all the way to church on Sunday, but that's okay sometimes. But the people of Israel didn't listen to them. They didn't understand what they were doing. And their first thought, let's go to war. And that's exactly how it is with us. When we don't understand the motives of the people that we disagree with, it's too easy for us to say they're evil, they're rotten, they're stupid, they're ugly, they smell, and their shoes are funny. But if we sit and talk and understand the motives of folks, we can begin to understand that they aren't necessarily against us, they're just different than us. If we're all ready to go to war at the first sign of any disagreement, we're never going to understand one another. Especially in the church. There are times when you are going to disagree with me vehemently, whether it's over a theological issue or over a stylistic issue, or maybe you don't like my haircut. But instead of being ready to go to war with one another, we have to learn to understand the motives behind. Because ultimately, I think we're all pretty good folks. And ultimately, I think we all want what Joshua admonished those tribes to do. We all want to love God. We all want to serve Him with everything that we have. We're just going to do it in different ways sometimes. I am not a Presbyterian by birth. My family heritage is Lutheran. My great-great-grandfather was the Lutheran pastor in Rio Linda, California, and he did the service in English in the morning and in German in the afternoon. That's some old-time Lutherans. But I chose to become a Presbyterian pastor because I love our system of government. I love the fact that the Presbyterian Church has a wide variety of perspectives on things. In this church, we got folks who are so narrow-minded they can see through a keyhole with both eyes at the same time. And we got folks who are so open-minded that their brains are leaking out their ears. The beauty of the Presbyterian Church is that we can fight and wrestle and disagree about concepts and vote, and somebody's going to win the vote, usually. But at the end of the day, we all agree to live by the results of the vote, and then we go back to being loving family members. And there's going to be another vote later, and your side might win then. The problem is that I think our society has affected our church, and we're having more and more trouble getting along. The tragedy is the society shouldn't be affecting the church. The church should be affecting the society. Can I get an amen on that one? Amen. We need to try and understand the motives of one another when we disagree, because you might discover that the person who's doing things exactly opposite of you wants the exact same end as you do. First, we got to make sure that we understand motives. Second, we need to make sure we listen. The problem with us is that usually while the other person is talking, we're formulating our next argument. And we don't listen to one another. Phinehas, the priest, and all the heads of the congregation, the heads of the military divisions of Israel, who were also with him, heard what they had to say, and they were satisfied. There's two parts here. They heard what they had to say. They took the time to actually listen and realized that they weren't doing something bad, they were just doing something different. The second part of this is they were satisfied. Sometimes we have to be satisfied with differences. We're not all going to agree on things. And that's okay. In fact, that's not just okay, that's really good. Because the wonderful thing about Alta is that even though we're friends and she's one of my strongest supporters, if I'm doing something she doesn't like, she'll get right in my face. And sometimes she's right. Okay, twice she was right, but sometimes she's right. I need that. You need that. If you hang around people who are just like you, you're never going to grow in life. We need to make sure that we understand motives. We need to make sure that we listen. And finally, we need to focus on common ground. You see, we as Christians have a whole lot more in common than we do differences. We as Americans have a whole lot more in common than we do differences. The tragedy is that we've been focusing on the differences, and it makes us fight. Going back to that family systems theory, there's an old saying in family systems theory that says, when mom and dad are fighting, we don't have to clean our rooms. That's why churches fight with each other so much. Because when they're fighting with one another, they don't have to do the important work that churches are supposed to do. They don't have to clean their rooms. They don't have to make sure that they reach out to the community and feed the poor. They don't have to make sure that kids learn about who Jesus is. They don't have to make sure that they're giving money to mission groups that serve our community and far places in the world. Because mom and dad are fighting, and we don't have to clean our rooms. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a difficult time for our church in general and for our nation. And I think it's because we're too ready to go to war with one another over misunderstandings. Yeah, we're going to disagree. Isn't that wonderful? If we would just take the time to try and understand what the motives of the other person is, because ultimately their goal is going to be the same as ours. But the motives are different. We have to understand them. And the only way we can do that is by listening. Not formulating our next argument, but listening and hearing one another and being satisfied with the differences. And then, instead of focusing on those differences, we need to focus on the common ground. Some pretty amazing things have happened in this church since I've been here. I don't think it has much to do with me. I think it has to do mostly with God working in this place. Folks who didn't get along before are now beginning to because we have a common goal. Let's not focus on the differences. Sure, when we do something good, let's celebrate. Let's commend one another. But let's not forget the ultimate purpose. Let's admonish one another to follow God. And then let's bless one another, even if the stuff that they're doing is a little weird. Because ultimately they want to serve God. And instead of fighting with one another, let's try and find common ground. Because ultimately we want the same thing. We're facing difficult times. Let's not be a church that's influenced by our society. Let's be a church that influences our society for the good and for Christ Jesus.